Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you so much for joining today. Really excited to present this webinar to you about micromessaging. This is a really important initiative for Project Lead the Way to really focus on equity. And our next 6 months with NAPE will help us to really enhance our work around equity so that our students and our teachers can have the best experience possible. We're working with NAPE for the next 6 months, and we've chosen them. They are a national expert in this area on STEM education and equity and have a lot to share with us and a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn from them. So, excuse me, we're so pleased that they'll be able to work with us over the coming months. So to set the stage, we will be working with NAPE for 6 months, and as part of our goals for our work together, it's going to be important that we, first of all, just establish a common understanding and vocabulary when we're working with equity principles. We all come from different experiences, different backgrounds. Some have graduate experience in this area, and some this might be your first introduction into the concepts around equity work. And so this will be really valuable for all of us, that we all have a common understanding, common experience, and common vocabulary to work from. Second of all, this will be really helpful for us to become more aware of our own implicit biases and how they shape perceptions. And not just our own, but also those of our students, our teachers, our colleagues, and those in the education field. This will be really important for us, again, so that we're thinking about students across the board. We have students, both male and female, all races, ethnicities, and all different parts of the country. And so we want to be thinking about our implicit biases and become a little bit more aware of that as we're developing. And this work is never really done. We're going to continue on not only for these 6 months, but after that as well. We'll continue to revisit this type of work. And then finally, this will offer us an opportunity to really develop leadership and knowledge in the areas of equity and learning. So for those who have experience in this area, you'll be able to share your knowledge, share your leadership, and for all of us, we're going to be able to grow together and learn. So those are the primary goals for our time together. And to give you an overview of what these next 6 months are going to look like, we'll move on to the timeline here. As you can see, we have this month, we'll have an all teams webinar, and our instructional leads will engage in a professional learning community where they'll be able to come together, talk about some of the items, issues, questions that they have that have risen to the top throughout their work. And then we'll be able to bring these questions to our team here at NAPE, and they'll be able to help guide, coach, as well as they'll provide some instruction and coaching as well to us. May, we will again have another webinar around values and work values, and this is incredibly important as we think about preparing all of our students for careers and how values play into that. We'll also again have another instructional leads meeting, or instructional leads PLC meeting in May. June, we know many people do take June off, or have some PTO scheduled in June, so we will reconvene again in July for a webinar on self-efficacy. And again, this is so important for students as we think about how they perceive themselves and how they achieve and succeed. Finally, July will also have another PLC with our instructional leads, and then September we will reconvene again for in-person, face-to-face workshops on culturally responsive teaching and ensuring equity and problem-based learning. Again, followed up by another instructional leads PLC. Throughout these next 6 months too, you'll have, we'll provide reflective material, learning material for you and your teams to meet and discuss these items during your weekly or bi-weekly team meetings. And this will be an opportunity for you to bring back examples in the curricula that you might see, your professional development of exemplary work or areas that we want to perhaps improve upon for next time. And this will be a time for us to really intentionally reflect about how we want to make, how the work that we're doing and how we want to make changes. One of the areas that you can really focus on too, we think about, is updates for our principles document, and how do we want to capture all of this information into our program product principles, and what other tools and processes do we want to establish and institutionalize that we can draw upon when we're developing. So hopefully, I don't think you'll be at a shortage for conversation material throughout these coming weeks, and we're really excited to be able to support this work. Do you have any questions? I will send out the dates and times for the webinars and PLCs this week. But if you have any other questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to answer those questions to you, as well as Brian, Vanessa, and Zach can also answer questions for you as well. I'll turn this over to Dr. Meagan Pollock. She is leading our work. She'll be working with us in the coming months, and excited to learn from her and to hear her insight and expertise in this area. So Meagan, turn it over to you.
Well, again, welcome to this webinar. I do want to let you know that we are recording the webinar today, and so this is for posterity for your organization. So for those of you who, for your colleagues who aren't able to make it today, they can refer back to this presentation for their own learning. I want to invite you now in the chat box to take a second and tell us who you are and where you are. I am in Dallas, Texas. My back door is open because it's beautiful here today. And a little bit about me, I have been working with NAPE for just about a decade now. I started as a consultant during my doctoral work, and then once I graduated, I became the Director of Professional Development and served in that role for 3 years. And then a couple of years ago, stepped back from that to take a position as Executive Director of a nonprofit called Design Connect Create. And we provide summer learning opportunities for girls to get them excited and passionate about science and engineering, and hopefully choosing those careers as they go into college. And so in the chat box, let us know who you are, your name, and your location. All right, welcome. Hi, looks like somebody's in my neck of the woods. Wow, your team is all over. That's fantastic. All right. Well, we've already taken the opportunity to do the poll for today, and so I got a good sense of where each of you are coming from and the lens that you're bringing to this work. And so I want to sort of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. As people who are developing curriculum, as humans in general, we all intend good things, right? Particularly of those of us who are in this education space. None of us go into this work with the intentions to harm our students that we're serving, with the intention of harming anyone for that matter. But the reality is there's a lot that happens in the way that we communicate that we aren't always aware of. And the impact of those messages can be much greater than our intent. And so our goal today is really about awareness and increasing our awareness of who we are and how the lens that we bring to life affects the work that we do and affects the communication that we have with others. And so I want to make sure that you have pulled this workbook that you should have all received in the mail. And so we're going to be flipping through some of the activities in here, and if there is a page that's referenced that you can reference in the book, you'll see that in the bottom left corner of the slide. And so you can follow along and refer back to this once we're done with our session today. And to get us started, I want to give you sort of a roadmap of what we're going to talk about. And so we're going to first start talking about cultural stereotypes and how prevalent they are in our society, and how we have stereotypes about every dimension of any identity possible, and how these stereotypes become biases. And biases these are the unconscious implicit biases that we're talking about, that each and every one of us have. And these biases begin to manifest not only in our interactions with one another, but they manifest in the work that we create. And these micro messages, they accumulate, and they can accumulate to either an advantage or a disadvantage for the people that we are aiming to serve. And that accumulation affects the self-efficacy of the end user. And self-efficacy is the belief that one has that they can accomplish a task. So one of the primary goals of PLTW is to increase student self-efficacy in STEM, to increase their belief that they can be successful in STEM and hopefully go on to choose a STEM career or to increase their STEM skill set in whatever profession that they choose. And that self-efficacy affects behavior. So if you have a high self-efficacy, you're going to choose behaviors that may challenge that status quo. And so you see this circle here, this loop, we call it the culture wheel. And so say, for example, if young women get lots of stereotypes, lots of implicit messages throughout their life, and those messages accumulate to say that STEM and engineering is not for them, that can lower their self-efficacy. And with that low self-efficacy, their behavior to not choose engineering then reinforces the cultural stereotype. So you can see how this happens. And so our goal is, as educators, as curriculum developers, as humans in this world, is to interrupt this cycle, and so that we become more aware of who we are and the biases that we hold and how those are unintentionally being communicated in our language and the work that we do. And so today we're going to spend our time really looking at bias and micromessages. We're going to briefly touch on self-efficacy just to sort of finish the loop, but we're going to have a whole webinar on that later this summer. And so to get us warmed up a little bit, I want to hear from you in the chat box. Tell me, what are some of the goals and expectations that you're bringing to our time today, and maybe some particular questions or concerns? And I want to get that information so that, one, I can potentially pivot and adjust to better serve your needs, and then also to let us know if some of those questions might be outside the scope of what we're doing today, but might come up later in our program. So go to the chat box and tell me, what are some of your goals and expectations for the next hour or so? So we have a goal to identify micromessages in our content. All right, we've got a few more here. Let me see if I can make this chat box bigger. What are specific steps to address bias? Continue to build awareness of micromessaging as you look to concrete steps. Time for you to reflect on your current practices. So one of the things that we anticipate will happen after this is that we're going to spend this time together, and then you're going to work with your team leaders to continue this conversation. This is certainly a continued journey that we're all beginning. Single stories. I didn't set up a poll ahead of time, but what percentage do we think of the people attending today attended the workshop a few weeks ago? Okay. Okay, so for the half of you that are here, this is very similar content, and so it's going to be a review for you. But I hope that what the result in that is that it's going to better equip you to lead conversations about micromessaging and bias with your colleagues. And so we will look to you for that leadership amongst your team. So thank you all for sharing your goals and expectations for the day. That's very helpful. All right, so the next thing is, what's the difference between equity and equality? And I'm going to set it up a little bit different here. So which image on the screen best illustrates equity? And then I would like for you to put in the chat box, what is the difference between equity and equality? And I've got a poll here. Let's see. So have a good look, because I think once I pop the poll up, the slides disappear. So which image best illustrates equity? And then in the chat box, what is the difference between equality and equity? All right, so we've got, it sort of goes back and forth between a quarter and a third of you think that A is the image that best illustrates equity, and then the rest of you, about 3/4 to 2/3, think that B represents equity. So I'm going to close the poll, and then I'll share that with you quickly. And in the chat box, tell us, what do you think is the difference between equality and equity? And explain to us why you came upon the answer that you did. So we have equality means everything is equal. Equity means that everyone gets what they need. Equity is giving everyone equal opportunity. Equality is giving everyone the same resources. Equity and giving resources opportunity to fit the needs. Equity allows everyone to equal access. Equality is treating everyone the same regardless of the method for the person. Yeah, so it looks like we're definitely on the right page here. And so this is NAPE's illustration of a really famous illustration that usually you see with the baseball field. And so you see here that the way that we've depicted this is that in many parts of our education system, it's been rooted in equality and giving every kid the same thing. But when you look at the image here on the, okay, thank you. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So it looks like the polls have to close before you can see the slides again. It's good. So you can see in the image on the left, this is an illustration of equality, which is how so much of our system of education has been built on, of giving every kid the same thing. And what you see is that it's not what every kid needs. We see that it's really dangerous to have a young girl in a wheelchair on a box, right? And then she still can't access the board. And then the boy figure on the left is tall enough. He doesn't necessarily need the extra box. And then the third little boy could use a little bit more of a lift. And so equity is giving every student what they need to succeed. And it's not about a zero-sum game. It's not about taking something away from students. It's about recognizing that we have X amount of resources and distributing those resources and those efforts and those intentions in a way that's going to best serve every student. And sometimes we have to think outside the box a little bit, and you'll see that the young girl in the wheelchair, she doesn't get the same thing. She gets a different resource altogether. And so this is the way that I want to set us up in this conversation, is thinking about how do we give the students what they need to succeed in the PLTW programs. And so I want us to keep coming back to this as we continue along. And you can download this image from NAPE's website. It's a free download if you want to use that and to hang it up in your space. So the next thing I want to do is I want you to do this in on your own piece of paper. So don't go to the chat box just yet. But I want you to list as many personal attributes about you as you can. And so to get you started, consider the prompt, I am blank, and then fill in the blank. And so you'll want to use identities like your race, your gender, maybe your ethnicity, your political party, your ability status, all those different kinds of things that are listed there on the bullet. So make a list of all of those things that describe who you are. All right, just give you a few more seconds to think about that list. And I'm going to advance us to the next reflection. And if you'd like to share something in the chat box, you can. And if you have or have not noticed, I'm not calling out people's names when I read your comments. And that's just for your own privacy, so that you may not want those comments shared for posterity in the video. So just want you to understand that. So now I want you to think about and reflect. Who we are informs our decisions. It informs how we see the world around us. And so based on the list that you just wrote down about yourself, which characteristics most shape your identity and perspective of the world? And then think about, what are the primary lenses through which you see and experience life? So reflect on these two questions. So for me, I am a white woman from a low to middle class family. I grew up in Texas. These are key characteristics that shape my identity and how I view the world. Now, certainly how I view the world has changed as I've grown up and aged and traveled and really sought to better understand different perspectives in our world. But that's been an absolute journey, and one to which will never be finished, so that I have a broader perspective of the world. But the fact that I am primarily a white female, that is going to always be the first lens to which I see things. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about today is this awareness of the lenses that we have and how we begin to push on those lenses and challenge those lenses and begin to see the world in different ways and see them through the experiences of other individuals. So the next activity is we're going to do a top 10 list, and these are, I want you to get another piece of paper. I want you to divide the piece of paper into 6 columns. In the first column, I want you to list the name or initial of the 10 people with whom you are closest. If you don't have 10 people, that's okay. The goal is to get up to 10. And so these could be your family members with whom you're closest, your former classmates, your friends, your community members, your colleagues. Make a list of those people. And then once you have that list, you're going to, in the other columns, you're going to note each person's race, their gender, their socioeconomic class as you perceive it, their sexual orientation, and their religious affiliation. And so again, take a minute, and then you're going to end up with 6 columns and 10 rows. So as you're completing this matrix, I want you to think about, what are you noticing? How might these people, the people in your top 10, how do they influence your lens or how you perceive the world? And if you're willing, I encourage you to add some of your reflections to the chat box to share with others. And if you have something you'd like to share, we can turn on audio for you as well. So we have one comment that says they're mostly like me. And Paula, I didn't mean to say your name. You're not alone. It's very common for the list of people that we create in our top 10 to be people who are very similar to us. So the next step is to think about how might this list and the either similarity or dissimilarity that they have from us, how might that affect our lens and how we perceive the world? If you want to raise your hand, we can let you share if you'd like to. What are some of your reflections on this exercise? So we have another comment that says that they're mostly like them, plus their direct family members. Another comment that says outside of 2 of the list, they're exactly like you. Yeah, and again, you're not alone, and there's nothing particularly wrong with that. It's the birds of a feather flock together is a long withstanding theory of how we relate to one another. But the question is how do we recognize the similarity? How does that change our lens? So we have another comment that says that their top 10 bring different views and experiences that challenge your lens. That's great. That's great. So what happens if all of the people in our list are mostly like us? I want to encourage you to continue thinking about this and who is close to you and how we begin to perceive the world based on who we are, and then those people that we put around us. So the next thing I want to introduce us to is the concept of the spheres of influence. This comes from Stephen Covey, and there are 3 spheres. And I introduce this to you because so often when we begin this work around educational equity or equity in general, it can feel a little overwhelming and to think about all of the things that are happening that influence student success. And generally, we can point a lot of fingers and say, like, all of these things are going on. And in most cases, we're right. All of these different things, there are so many different things are influencing the success of the students that we're serving. But what we can't do is to hang out on those fringes of things that we can't control. And so the inner ring of the sphere of influence are those things that we can control. So as most of you, I guess half of you here, are curriculum developers. And so what is it? I want you to make a list of, like, what are the things that as in your role or whichever role that you have, what are the things that you control? And then the next loop is a circle, or what are the things that you can influence? And then the outer ring are things that you can have concern for, but you have no control and influence over. And to sort of situate where we're going to begin this process, I want you to make this list of things that you can do in your role to begin to implement some of the strategies and the thoughtfulness that we're going to talk about today and over the next 6 months. And so again, if you're interested in sharing some of that with the group, please do that in the chat box. So spend a few minutes. When it comes to applying what you will learn today, we want to focus our attention on those things that we can control or those things that we can influence, and let go of those things that we can't. So as you're making these lists, share with us in the chat box some of the things that you, as a PLTW employee, what are some of the things that you have control over, and how you can begin to apply some of the things that we're going to talk about today, specifically around awareness and then equity in general. So thanks to the first person who chimed in on this question. So you have control over your own learning and understanding, absolutely. The text and language that students read in the curriculum, yes. Control over providing a variety of images and your assets that reflect students that you serve, absolutely. I would suspect also that those of you who are in the professional development side, that you have influence over the educators who are teaching your curriculum. Wouldn't it be nice if we had more control, but we don't, and so we absolutely have influence over how they present the work that you've developed. Stories and situations also added in the chat box. Stories and situations that students can relate to. Yes, student content and lesson approach, teacher resources and support. Excellent. All right, well, I want you to hang on to this list that you've created, and we'll keep coming back to it. Or what I want you to do is to keep coming back to it as we move forward over the duration of this full program that we'll do together. And someone else added, bringing in consultants, advisors to grow your knowledge and skills. Absolutely. All right, I want to step us forward here. So we're going to start walking through the cultural wheel. And the first thing that we're going to talk about are cultural stereotypes. And so what I want you to do is to also chat in the box. I want you to note what are the cultural stereotypes that you identify in the images that I'm going to show here on the screen. And what I'm trying to sort of demonstrate through the 3 slides that I'm going to show you are a series of images that begin to sort of create a single narrative, all right? So you're going to be chatting in the box about the stereotypes that you see. So these are a couple of images that I'm going to show you that are from a Lands End catalog. This particular pair from a catalog in 2012. Lands End has had several interesting examples of this over time. These are the set of images that we're going to talk about today, though. So the first set of images on the left is a red bag. It's got like yellow piping stripes on it. It has the name Matthew monogrammed on it and a soccer ball monogrammed. The backpack version has some books in the bag and then a little shark LED flashlight. And the fine print is not important here, but the heading I want us to look at and consider too: super light, superhero tough. So when you look at this image, what are the stereotypes that you see? So boys play sports and can be superheroes. Yes, what else? Boys are rough and tough. Athletic. What else do you see? So let's look at what image was on the next page of this catalog. We had some more commentary. It says the red and black or yellow are what we call typical boy colors. They've been colors that are sort of gendered at this point. Someone else adds it makes you think of light-skinned boys. Boys have to be tough, superhero stereotype, active and bold. Yes. So on the next page of the catalog was another set of images, and this has a satchel that's sort of like a purple checked, and it has the name Chloe monogrammed on it. There's no emblem or shape like the soccer ball before. It's the same yellow piping stripes on it. The backpack version, there's no books or shark keychain, but has a water bottle in the bag. And the heading here says, light as a feather, tough as long division. So again, let's identify what are the stereotypes that we see. That math is hard for girls, according to the chat box. Yes. We got a wow in there also. Yes. Girls are delicate. Girls shouldn't carry anything heavy. Yeah. What's something that you might notice about socioeconomic status out of these pair of images? What kind of image does it bring up about who buys these bags? So before, I've heard commentary around there's sort of a soccer mom stereotype affiliated with this. Someone added in the chat box the monogram sort of signals helicopter parents. The purple suggests royalty. Chloe is a stereotypical white name. Someone who has money to monogram the bags. We have a question that says, what about the ones who don't buy either? Yeah, I don't know what stereotypes would go to describe them. But yeah, so there's certainly a price that's attached to these kinds of things. So let's look at the next set of images. These are real t-shirts. I did not make these up. This one says, I'm too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me. This one, my best subjects, shopping, check. Music, check. Dancing, check. Math, well, nobody's perfect. This one, I'm too pretty to do math. The next one, who needs math when you're already a 10? And then finally, allergic to algebra. Again, what are the stereotypes that you see in these images? Yes, to the person who said horrible. Yes, I agree. And also, I second the wow. We have a comment, it relies heavily on females relying on looks to get by. The not caring about academics is cool. Girls are meant to look good, not to think. Superficial. Just waiting for some more things in the chat box to share. Yeah, so we certainly see a sort of gendered assumption, both in the color choices, and it's certainly any person could wear this shirt, but we assume that they are targeted to girls and that girls will be wearing them. So we have another comment that's to rely on your brother to do the hard work. That boys, another comment says that boys are academically successful more so than girls. Yeah. So let's look at the next set of images. So here we have Dilbert. Dilbert is a cartoon caricature. He's an engineer that's sort of relegated to cubicle life and has sort of become the archetype for what it means to be an engineer. We've got the cast of The Big Bang Theory, and then we've got the Geek Squad. So when you look at these three images, what are the stereotypes that you see represented? Reading some of the comments, scientists are nerds, all smart people are nerds, smart people are geeks, nerdy, yeah, so engineer equal nerds. So definitely this theme that to be a scientist or engineer, you sort of represent this nerd archetype. Another comment says that tech is filled with socially awkward people. Yeah, so this is a long withstanding stereotype. I remember when I was growing up, I was looking through some photos. I was doing like a junior high class project, and I found this photo of my dad, who happens to be a tall white guy, and he was the photo was him wearing high water pants. I can't remember the shoes, but there were certainly some ankle showing. And he had on a white shirt with a pocket protector. He had on suspenders. He didn't have the sort of flippy tie there. And he had on glasses, like the thick Buddy Holly glasses, literally with like tape on them. And I remember asking my dad, I was like, Dad, this is hilarious. Like, is this your Halloween costume? And then he looks at me like this and sort of shakes his head, and he's like, no, that was not a costume. And my dad, by the way, is a computer scientist, and as is his father. Both of them are computer scientists. My granddad, by the way, still dresses like this. My dad's got some style now, but this has sort of become this archetype of what it means to be an engineer or scientist. We also had another comment there that says darker skin color engineers aren't represented. Yeah, absolutely. It sort of, again, perpetuate the stereotypes of this sort of singular narrative. And so what I'm trying to paint a picture here are how all of these stereotypes begin to create what we call a single story. And this is a quote from a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story. And the famous quote here that I rely on so often is that the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So as an example, the stereotype has fit my father and my grandfather. So it's not incorrect, right? It's not untrue. It's just incomplete. It doesn't incorporate all of the ways that you could be, how you could be an engineer. And so what we want to do is to be really thoughtful in the work that we are doing as curriculum developers and professional development and any kind of marketing communications work that you're doing at PLTW, to thinking about what are the single stories that we may unintentionally be perpetuating, and how do we begin to challenge those? And so I have a homework assignment for those of you who weren't with us when we were together a few weeks ago at Indy. So I'd love for you to watch this TED Talk. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. Type that in. It's the first thing that comes up on Google. It is my favorite TED Talk. I've literally seen it hundreds and hundreds of times, and it never gets old to me. And so I'd love to encourage you to watch that. It's just a really good investment of 15 minutes of your time. And then I want you to reflect, what are the single stories that you've experienced in your life? What are single stories that persist related to STEM? And then how are those single stories unintentionally perpetuated in your work? It looks like some of you may have already watched the talk as preparation for today. That's fantastic. Yay. So if that's the case, share with me in the chat box some of the things that you learned out of watching that film, and some of the things that came out of your discussion and your teams. So if you've already seen this film and had a discussion with your team, looks like not everyone watched it. So we had one comment that said one group watched it as prep for today. So kudos to you. If you haven't watched it, please take a snapshot of this and use this as some thoughtful homework and as a way to have a conversation with your colleagues. The other key value of this is that it introduces a vocabulary of this word, this phrase of single story, so that as you all are continuing to collaborate and to work together, oh, we got a link popped up there. Thank you for sharing that. As you all begin to collaborate and move forward as we're in this process of learning about educational equity and how we can integrate that into our work, use this phrase to help challenge yourself and to challenge one another and how you are developing work. And so it's a friendly way of saying, hey, that might be a single story. What are other stories that we can tell to increase the narrative of students and access to these different kinds of opportunities and careers and pathways? All right, so we have these stereotypes, right? And nothing that we just went over was new knowledge, right? We didn't create new knowledge. You were drawing on things that were in your brain already. And that's how bias happens. And so to give you an example, I'm going to tell you a story. I call it the case of the mistaken $1,000 egg. A couple years ago, I was at a conference. It was a small conference, and but I was working a booth for NAPE, and I was also trying to participate in sessions, and so it was kind of going a little bit nuts, running around like with the chicken with my head cut off, hence the eggs. And there was a contest that was going on, and they said, in your bag, everybody got like a swag bag or whatever. They're like, if there's an egg in your bag, bring it to us before the end of the day, and that means that you've won a $1,000 grant for your organization. And so again, I'm really busy. I'm not like fully understanding what they mean as an egg. And so I look in my bag, and I'm not looking for an egg like that's on the screen, right? Because that would just be silly. Why would they put a real egg in my bag? I was looking for something like this, right? This is what I picture of what an egg would look like that would be stuffed in my bag. Well, I looked in my bag and I didn't see anything that was like a plastic Easter egg. And so I went home and I, was sort of going through all of my stuff for the day. And sure enough, I found this thing in my bag. There's also this book in there. Now, this is an egg. I've never seen an egg that's fuzzy, that has feet or a crown on it. And so when I was looking in my bag, there was no point in my life to which I've interacted with an egg that looks like this. And so I remember when I was at the conference site, like I opened my bag and I remember seeing it, but it didn't register as something that was an egg. I just thought, oh, somebody just put this in my bag. I thought my colleague had bought something in, and anyways. So I get home, I read the book. Somebody said it's one of your favorite children's books. I agree. I gave this book to my niece and nephew, and I told them that this is a $1,000 book and egg because I called the organization and they wouldn't give me that grant. And so the point here is that our brains process information by the things that we have stored in them. I assure you, if I am ever at a point to have a contest to find another egg, now this adds to my brain's view of what an egg might look like. It's not just going to be the kitchen egg, it's not going to be the plastic egg, but now I know what furry eggs look like. And this is how our brain works. Our brain creates schemas, and a schema is this pattern of thought or behavior and how our brain begins to organize them and creates relationships among them. And so these single stories become the schemas in our brain. And so you see here on the screen, these are the single stories that have been told over and over again about scientists and engineers, and that becomes a schema in our brain. So let's dig into this. So some of you who were with me a few weeks ago have already seen this, so don't give it away just yet. But for those of you who haven't, I want you to look at the image and tell me, what do you see? I'm not going to activate the poll, because if I activate the poll, it makes the image go away. So just add in the chat box, what do you see when you look at this image? Two cats, snow melting. Somebody said clouds, a cow, snow prints, and snow, part of a map, Earth and space. So we've got a lot of different things. Now, someone is correct. Let's look at this. It is an image of a cow, and so it's outlined there. But most of us didn't identify this because we have certain schemas in our brains of what cows look like. This is an example of one of the most famous cows that we know. I think it's a dairy cow. I was just in Montana last week. My college best friend grew up on a Montana ranch, and before I became friends with her, I don't know, 13 years ago, I really had no understanding about the different species of, different types of species of cows, but she has taught me so much. Like, her family raises Hereford cows. They're very beautiful brown and like furry cows, and so as a result of being her friend, I now have lots of different schemas of different types of cows. I know now no longer just look at a cow and see it as a simple cow. I know that each cow is different. There's different kinds of species. And so what this is trying to tell us is that most of us won't see this because we don't have this image of that as a cow. And then it's true that the research tells us also about a third of you still will not see it, even after we've outlined it here. And what's also interesting is that you may not remember it when you come back to it also. So I saw this image years ago demonstrated, and I remembered the lesson that it was teaching, but I didn't remember what it actually was. And I came back to the image and I still couldn't identify it as a cow. And so you may not view it even after multiple times of seeing it. Though the research they did found that once you see it, you're more likely to keep seeing it. And so when we're talking about unconscious bias, it's sort of this connection of schemas and how they become these implicit biases, is that these unconscious biases that we were biased to what we saw in those images. When we think about the egg story, I was biased of what I thought an egg should look like. And so that bias influences how we reach decisions. It's how our brain makes sense of the gathering and sorting and filtering of all of the information in our brain, and it influences our evaluations of people and their value. Now, what's critical to recognize here is that the way that unconscious bias happens is it may not reflect your value and your current belief system. Because what happens is, if you think about your brain as rows and rows and rows of file cabinets, lots of information is stored in those file cabinets. When we went through the cultural stereotypes about the images that we showed with the bag and the t-shirts and then the archetype, of engineers, you drew from something that was stored in your file cabinet, right? You didn't add anything new into the file cabinet. And so because those things exist in your brain has access to them and it draws on those things. Unconscious bias is more influential on how we interact in the work that we do when we are busy, tired, exhausted, stressed. Does that describe any of you? Yes, it does, right? And so when we are in those conditions, our brain is drawing on those things even faster than we might recognize, because we aren't able to be thoughtful about what our brain is drawing on. I have a comment here that from someone that they use this as an exercise for your AP Calculus students to show them that until you see something, you don't see it. It's not a reason for stress or to feel stupid. Yeah. And we don't know what we don't know, right? And so we have to begin to add more images and add more experiences and add more stories so that our brain can access those things at a more regular rate. Let me give you a couple of examples. So there was years ago, in 1970, females represented less than 5% of symphony orchestras. And whoever the people are that run symphony orchestras decided that they wanted to increase the participation of women being selected for the orchestra. So what they decided to do was to implement blind auditions with the expectation that it would increase the representation of women selected for the orchestra. So what do you think happened? Well, what happened is that they did see a very small increase, but it wasn't the increase that they were expecting. And so upon analyzing what happened is, if you think about, where do most auditions for a symphony take place? They take place in symphony halls. What are the stages in symphony halls made out of? They're made out of wood. What do many women wear for important occasions? They would wear shoes that have heels or shoes that would make some kind of noise. And so despite the fact that they had put up this wall and they were trying to not be biased, their brain was still hearing that sound of the click-clack of heels and subtly triggering deeply rooted cultural stereotypes and how they selected these women. So again, they were trying to not be biased, and just the sound of a heel click made them think, oh, this is unconsciously think about the role of women in symphony orchestras. And it doesn't make these people bad people, right? They were trying to not be biased, but their brain was drawing on all of those deeply rooted cultural stereotypes about women and their place in the workforce and their ability to fit in with the symphony orchestra people. And so what they found is that once they implemented these blind auditions, by the mid-90s, females increased to about a quarter. And then about 5 years ago, they found that now about 30% of women are in the symphony orchestras. But I forgot the key thing here is that to change this, so they put carpet down, right? So by putting carpet down, it eliminated that click-clack of the heels that could unconsciously trigger an identification of gender and their role in the symphony. And so this is important for us in our work and how we're engaging in whatever role that you're in. If you are hiring people, if you are evaluating, in any way that you're evaluating things, we want to put up as many barriers and carpets as we can to protect ourselves. From the biases that we inherently have and may communicate unintentionally. I want to give you one more example of a way to look at this. So I grew up in Southeast Texas, sort of near Galveston, and growing up, before my brothers and I started playing sports, we'd go to the beach. The beach we went to is called Sea Rim State Park. We would go there quite a bit on the weekends. And I remember when we were going there, my dad would always tell us, like before we got in the water, he would say, what do you do if there's a riptide? And I remember I always knew the answer, right? Like to swim parallel to the shore, but I had no idea what he was talking about. I couldn't see the riptides. I didn't know what they looked like. I had never been explained to me like what they did. All I knew is that they were out there and they were gonna get me. And this was always important because my dad would like go way out further than I could touch, and he was like a killer wave jumper. And so I knew it was important, but again, I couldn't see it, and I knew that this riptide was out there and it was gonna get me. And so this is sort of like bias. Inside each and every one of us is a riptide. We don't always see it. We don't always recognize it. We don't always know when it's going to show up and when it might show up and get us. Because inside this riptide is what I call the riptide of single stories. So it's all of those singular narratives that we've told about people over and over again, about people and groups of people. And this riptide is very dangerous if we get stuck in it. But what we can do is to get out of the riptide. And to get out of the riptide is to recognize that there's an ocean full of many stories that we can draw from. And so, again, going back to this notion of the singular image, by adding more images of what it means to be a scientist or engineer, and I've just added 6 different examples here. When you add more images, more stories into your file cabinets, right? So we're adding more to the file cabinets. The odds of your brain unconsciously pulling from the 3 in the middle become lower, right? So you're never going to get rid of those images, but the idea is to put more images and stories in your file cabinets. So when you're having these interactions with other people, it's more likely to draw on something else. And so that's the good news of how bias works and how we can begin to change that in our brains. So I want to offer you another homework assignment, and that's to take the implicit association test. And this is another great exercise to do and to discuss with your team. And so the project is called Project Implicit, and it's led by a team of universities. It's hosted at Harvard, and what you see at the bottom is an example of the distribution of results. So this is for one person. So you take the implicit association test, and what it does is you're having to respond to images or words or however each of the tests are set up. You have to respond instantly. If you are slow and think about it, you are no longer drawing on your implicit associations. And so if you are slow, it actually throws those out. And so this particular person took the male and career and female with family association, and you'll see that they had a 32% moderate to automatic association of male with career and female with family. So this is a distribution of their responses, right? And now this person's not alone. 70% of 70 million people across the globe who have taken this test, this particular test, have the same bias. And it's not hard for us to imagine where this bias comes from when we look at the history of our world and the gender roles that have been part of our history. And the reason why we take this is about increasing our awareness, and it's a starting point. And so I encourage you to do this. And if you go to napequity.org/IAT, there's some great videos that you can refer to learn more about that as well. And I do encourage you to pick up the book Blind Spot: The Hidden Biases of Good People. It's a great book and a wonderful introduction to this concept as well. All right, so we have these biases. All of us have them. All of us good people, we all have these biases, and these biases manifest through what we call micromessages. Micromessages are small, subtle, unconscious messages that are both sent and received when we communicate and interact with others. There are two types of micromessages. Microaffirmations build others up. They make students, as our focus here, feel valued, included, encouraged. They're always positive, and they can be intentional. Our goal is to be intentional at providing microaffirmations that help our students be more successful in STEM. Oh, it looks like somebody just added that they just finished reading Blind Spot. Fantastic. And they said that it's a great read. Thanks for sharing that. So the next kind of micromessage are what we call micro inequities. These are messages that make students feel excluded, devalued, discouraged. They're always negative, and they are always unintentional. If at any point micro inequities become intentional, we call that something else. So again, these are always unintentional messages. There are 6 ways that micro messages can show up and how we communicate. The first is verbal. It's simply what is said. This is the easiest to identify because it's our brain processes it more consciously. But the second type of micro message is how it's said. This is the tone. How many of you have ever told your partners, your kids, your colleagues, your classmates, whomever, to watch your tone, right? That's the tone that we use that communicates something that our words may not be communicating. Nonverbal is simply our body language. What's the language that our body is sending, and how might that not actually be aligned with our intention? The next two I like to talk about together, contextual and omission. This is what is said or not done, and it's what is present or not present. My Project Lead the Way story here is when I did my dissertation in a Project Lead the Way school, and I worked with one teacher, and I essentially went to high school for 3 months and studied the experiences of young women in high school engineering. And as a part of that process, I needed to do an environmental scan of the classroom environment. And one of the first things I noticed is that there was a shelf full of robots, and all of the robots were named with the cute little stickers that were very Western boy Judeo-Christian names like John and Matthew. And I remember asking the teacher, who happened to be an engineer and also happened to be a woman, I was like, hey, so how come there are no other names of other genders? And I remember her face was like, she had not intended to do that at all, right? Just like the rest of us, she was busy and trying to get a lot done, and she just needed to name them so that they could easily be assigned. And she unintentionally omitted any kinds of other names, right? And so this can send a really powerful micro message, right? So you think about a shelf full of robots not being that big of a deal, but if you are one of 20 students in that class that's a young woman, and you come into the class and you're already aware that there aren't many of you in that space and that there aren't many of you in those career paths, and now you see the shelf with all of the names of the boys, it's another subtle reminder that you don't belong in that space. And so this teacher, she went on to change the names because that wasn't a message that she was intending, and she wanted to be more thoughtful to that. Praise and criticism, these are the feedback messages that we give and how we give them. The research shows that both men and women are equally guilty at praising girls more for how pretty their work is than boys for the quality of their work. And that goes back and aligns to some of the stereotypes that we saw in all of those t-shirts. And we have to be intentional about recognizing how bias shows up in each of these ways that we communicate, and so that we can begin to challenge and adjust those. Let's do this for a little bit of practice. So you can add to the chat box here. So for the first one, the cue is a consistent use of generic he, man, or guys to represent both men and women. And there's a full exercise on this on pages 14 and 15 in your workbook, and I encourage you to do this on your own after we're done today. But let's do these together. So number one, which element do you think that is? And so the elements are these things: the verbal, paraverbal, nonverbal, contextual, omission, praise, and criticism. And then what do you think the message received? So let's add some thoughts to the chat box. Consistent use of he, man, or guys to represent both men and women. What's the element and message you think that might be? If you want to work ahead, you can add the number to your response in the box. So consistent use of he, man, or guys, this is a verbal cue, and it can send the message that female students are invisible and unimportant in those spaces. And we always get lots of commentary about how guys has become a colloquialism and it's common and it's no big deal. But I assure you that when I am the only female in a class of 70 male engineers in grad school, and the professor keeps calling us guys, I am astutely aware in that moment that I am not a guy. And again, these are unconscious messages that we're both sending and receiving. And so my brain is unconsciously receiving, I'm not part of this group, I don't fit in this group. And so that is what begins to encourage our girls to leave those spaces. So we can just use more inclusive language. It doesn't mean that people are sensitive to it. It's that our brain is unconsciously registering, do I belong here, or do I? And so by using more generic non-binary, gender binary language, or just using other words, better serves our students. And so when the curriculum that you're developing, unless you need to have a gender, don't. Whoever the people are that write the English language, they have now said that the word they can be used as a singular pronoun. And so I encourage you to use they unless you must use a gender. The second cue is selecting class materials and textbooks without vetting for gender inequities and stereotypes. This is contextual omission. And the message that it might send is that females don't have the intellectual capacity to contribute. And the next one, using only males as examples of scientists, technologists, researchers, or people who are considered smart. Again, that's contextual omission, and it can send the message that reinforces gender stereotypes of females being more suited for certain roles and ill-suited for others. And finally, the last example we have here is praising females more for the form and appearance of their work and praise males more for the content of their work. And this is a praise and criticism element, and the message sent is that females' value rests in their external attributes of appearance. And this is going to be a great tool for you, for those of you who are doing the professional development of people who teach your curriculum, is to provide this as a strategy for them to be really thoughtful about how they're giving feedback. Again, both men and women are more likely to praise girls for how pretty their work is than for the quality. And this is something I noticed in my research as well. So we have a side question here. Do we have anything implemented that touches on teaching such as these for the students and teachers? For example, the graphic with the two people and the blocks. I think that's a question for the PLTW team. Anyone want to add some response to that? Yeah, so think about that question and you all can come back to it together. And I encourage you to download that image from our website and certainly use it as a teaching tool in your work. All right, so again, I encourage you to do the cues and message activity that's in your workbook. You can do it as a team and reflect on it together. We're gonna skip this. Okay, so we do have a response to the question there. We have some resources, but through this work, we plan to identify what new resources we should develop for both students and teachers. Excellent. All right, so advancing in the culture wheel, when these micro messages happen, the power of them is not in the single micro message. The power is in the accumulation. And so as I was saying with the example of the guys, and if a student is in a space where they are already one of the marginalized populations in that space, which for most of the courses that you're engaging in are women and students of color, then what happens is it's the accumulation of these micro messages that becomes really powerful. And so I want you to think of the scales, the scales of justice, right? And so it's this balance of positive and negative micro messages. My favorite example of this is of one of my college professors. His name is Dr. Ron Cox, and he's one of my favorite professors because he has like the best stories. He started the program that funded all my school. So when I was 18 and starting college, he was still working at Texas Instruments, and he'd worked like his entire career there, something like 45 years. And he started this program called Women in Engineering, and to which paid for all my school. And so it was to get young women who are majoring in math and computer science, give them internships, and then pay for them to go get a master's in electrical engineering. And so by the time I got to the master's part, he had retired and had become a professor at Texas Tech. And so I was taking the class where I was the one female in a class full of 70 students. And what I love about him is he had the best story. So one day he was like queuing up the story, and he's like, who knows something about trains? And I like shot my hand up, and his immediate response was immediate, like, Meagan, you're a girl, why would you know anything about trains? Now, what that was a deeply rooted, unconscious, implicit bias that sort of spewed out of his mouth that signaled I didn't belong in this space. But what the benefit here is sort of the good news, bad news. The bad news is that we're going to continue to send messages that we don't intend. But the good news is that I had so many positive messages from him over the years that it didn't tip the scale for me. So he was intentional about providing those positive messages and making me feel like I belonged and like I included, that it didn't tip the scale. And so this is what we want to do as educators and curriculum developers and writers, is how do we stack the deck, per se, so that students are getting as many positive micro affirmations that they belong there, that they are suited for these professions, and that this is for them. So we have this accumulation, and it affects self-efficacy. And we're going to touch on this just a little bit here, but we're going to have a whole webinar about this later on. And so self-efficacy is the belief that one has that they can accomplish a task. And it answers the question, can I do this? And again, it's always task-based. So it could be a big task, a small task, a complex task, or a very simple task, but it's always a task, and it answers, can I do this? And our students, our teachers who are teaching this, they're constantly asking themselves this question, can I do this? And that affects our behavior. If they think that they can't do it, then what happens? They don't do it. It's important to note here that self terms are not all the same. So don't hear me say self-esteem, because that's not what I'm saying. Self-efficacy, why that's so important is self-efficacy predicts academic achievement. while self-esteem does not have a strong correlation with success in school. Self-esteem answers the question, how do I feel about myself? Again, self-efficacy answers, can I do this? And that's what predicts academic achievement, not how you feel about yourself. And so I want to make sure that you take that away. We'll work on that in more depth later this summer. So a student who has a high self-efficacy, they are more likely to have greater achievement, interest, motivation, engagement, persistence, performance, all the things that we want, right? And a student also who has a high self-efficacy, they're more likely to adopt and commit to more challenging goals. So we use the imagery of a mountain here because nobody's ever climbed Everest having not probably climbed Kilimanjaro, right? Like you climb mountains and you get bigger and bigger in the mountains that you climb. And a student with a low self-efficacy, they're more likely to doubt, fear, and avoid tasks. And this is also reciprocal. So if students get into a place of having a low self-efficacy, they often begin to transfer that to other similar skills. There are 4 sources of self-efficacy, and I'm just going to throw these up here and briefly introduce them. Again, we'll go over them this later this summer. But the first is mastery experiences. These are previous experiences and performance that might signal whether we could do something similar. Vicarious experiences, this is the observation of models. And so that could either be watching a teacher do what you're trying to get the student to do, or bringing in someone from industry or someone that looks like your students that they can relate to and say, okay, well, if they can do it, then I can do it. Social persuasion, this is the feedback and support from others. And then the fourth are emotional and physiological cues. So these are the physical reactions that if we interpret as signs of our ability, it will lower our self-efficacy. So physiological cues or emotional cues would be like anxiety, or if you get really flushed when you speak, or if you get hot and sweaty, or if you just get butterflies in your stomach. These are different types of emotional and physiological cues. So if you have this physiological cue and you say, oh, I get nervous, therefore I can't be a public speaker, then that will lower your self-efficacy. Rather than just saying, my body is having a reaction, it doesn't mean it doesn't limit my capability to do these different kinds of things. So in the workbook that we're reviewing today, there are strategies for building self-efficacy on page 26 and 27. For the sake of time, I want to invite you to do this in your small groups. And again, we're going to come back to this in a few months. I just wanted to close the loop on our circle, but you can look to those strategies on 26 and 27 to begin implementing in your work. All right, I want to get us to a point of a little bit of action planning here. To sort of wrap up what we've talked about, we've got an infographic on page 31 that sort of encourages us to recap the things that we've got. So when you're ever trying to figure out what did we talk about and what are we encouraging to do, I want you to think about checking the radio and tuning in to micro messages, where radio stands for these different things. First, we want to reflect on bias and stereotypes that exist in ourselves and in the work that we do. A, we want to anticipate the impact of decisions, words, and behaviors. D, we want to discover and address negative micro messages. And then I is to identify ways to give positive micro messages. Again, that's sort of how do we stack the deck in your content and curriculum and professional development of educators so that students are getting lots of positive micro messages that help tip the scale to the positive. And then finally, this is really tied to self-efficacy that we'll talk more about later this summer, but offering high expectations and what we call wise feedback. And so how can you develop in your content and curriculum and programs this notion of giving feedback that's really going to support and build the self-efficacy of your students? And so again, our goal today is really to focus on our personal awareness and sort of laying the groundwork with the vocabulary to help us move forward in this larger program. And so I encourage you to begin practicing how biases are manifested in the ways that you communicate, and really start exploring where do these biases that you might hold, where do they come from? And how do you begin to increase the dismantle the single stories that you hold to add more narratives to your file cabinet and your brain, and so that you can better communicate your true values that you have for individuals? We want to address micro inequities, and so these are ways that these show up in all of the things that you're doing moving forward, and then as time allows, going back to examine what you've already done and created. And then finally, figuring out how do you actively provide intentional micro affirmations that build our students up so that they feel like they belong and that they are part of the community that you work so hard to build. I want to give you a second to do a quick application. So I want you to think about all the things that we've talked about over the last hour and a half and write down what are 3 things that you've learned, 2 things that you will do differently, and 1 immediate action item. So write those things down, and if you'd like to share your immediate action item into the chat box with everyone else, that would be fantastic. And as you're reflecting, if you have questions that you'd like to add in the chat box, please add those as well. So we have some comments to stop using the word guys to everyone. And I'll tell you, it's a really hard thing to break. As a Texan, I worked really hard to stop using y'all as I came into my 20s, and then I started using guys, and now it's really hard to stop saying either. So good luck, and be patient with yourself as you're trying to coach your language to be different. We have another action item to watch out for the micro messages that you might be communicating with your own children. Absolutely. So this that we're talking about, this transfers to all aspects of our life, and so we are sending micro messages all the time and every which way. Another action item is to watch the TED Talk video and take the implicit association test. Yes, you got the homework assignments. And then review your own micro messages with others around them. So we have a question of what to use an alternative. So, oh, somebody says you can't use y'all. No, I stopped using y'all because I was trying to lose my Southern accent. You can use y'all if you want. That was my own preference of my 20s of trying to shake my Texas accent. So we've got examples of y'all or folks. One of the most useful things, particularly for building student self-efficacy, is to call them, when working with students, to call them academics, to call them scientists, to call them engineers, to call them problem solvers, to call them whatever it is, the identity that you're trying to develop them. You're working with your team, say, hey team, hey, anything other than guys. So you can say team, colleagues, friends, everyone. Yes, so you could make a list together with all the different kinds of things that you could use. We had another comment here that they'll be mindful with the words when communicating with your daughters. Absolutely. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We do have an evaluation that we'd love to get your feedback on so that we can continue to improve our program and how we serve you. In the materials section today, there's a link that goes to our evaluation. If you can click on that and complete that at your earliest availability, we would really appreciate that. And I want to leave you with this one quote. This is a quote from the same woman who did the TED Talk Danger of the Single Story, but this is from her novel Americana. And I love this quote because I feel like it gives me courage to do things I wouldn't have otherwise done. And she writes, "If you don't understand, ask questions. If you're uncomfortable about asking questions, say you are uncomfortable about asking questions and then ask anyway. It's easy to tell when a question is coming from a good place. Then listen some more. Sometimes people just want to feel heard. Here's to the possibilities of friendship and connection and understanding." And the takeaways here are to give you courage to ask questions, to understand, to listen. So when we're asking someone a question, we want to listen for their benefit and not infuse all of our own biases that we might have, and then ensure people feel heard. Again, I want to thank you so much for your time. My contact information, I can go back to, I can add it in the chat box here. So my email is mpollock@napeequity.org. And I sent that to not the whole group. I invite you to contact me if you have any questions, and we will see you all again soon. We have a couple of reflection questions that we want to, that I'm going to send to you so that you can use them as you begin to apply this. I'll read them to you now. In what ways might an equity lens refine or change your curriculum and PD work within PLTW? And second, what aspects of PLTW's curriculum and professional development instruction principles reflect an equity stance, and where's there room for refinement? And so again, I'll send these questions to Caroline so that she can distribute them to you to begin thinking about your application. And Caroline, I will turn the mic back over to you. And thank you all so much for your participation today.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. And I know you can't hear us, but we're all applauding in our home offices. So thank you so much for your time today. And I will, again, follow up with all of the links from today as well, and reflection questions. Thanks so much for your participation and for your engagement and vulnerability. This is important and hard work, and we have a huge responsibility if you think about the impact that we have and the students that we reach across the country, and also what we're up against. I mean, there are a lot of biases out there, and how can we make sure that we are doing our best to confront and reduce stereotypes and make our experiences the best that they can be for students and teachers. So looking forward to our continued work. Thanks again, Megan and Kathleen. And if you have any questions, please follow up.